Welcome everyone to our next episode of Infrastructure Insights, and we've got a very special guest today in the form of Olivia Powis. Olivia is the CEO of a leading European association called the Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage Association. And Olivia, delighted to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us. Just for our kind of solicitors' benefit, as there'll be people who may not have heard of the organisation before, could you just please sort of take this opportunity to introduce yourself and the organisation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for inviting me on. I'm Olivia Powis, so I'm Chief Exec of the CCSA, as you said, so Carbon Capture and Storage Association. And we're a trade association that supports the commercial deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage. So we have members, we've got over 130 members now across Europe, mainly across UK and the EU. And some international members as well, and they're right across the supply chain, so right across the value chain. So we've got storage developers, we have the industries that will be using carbon capture to decarbonise, infrastructure providers, i.e. pipeline, shipping, other road and rail, non-pipeline transport. We have companies that represent the supply chain as well. Within that, capture developers, so developing the new capture technologies, and then also support services around financial, legal services as well. So it's a very long value chain, and we've got members that represent right across that. So by engaging with our members and making sure we work with them, we help to influence policy and also the framework, the commercial framework, so that this industry can really get up and running right across Europe and expand to have long-term sort of commercial deployment.
Fantastic. And you've been with the organisation since 2021, is that right?
Yeah, so I joined in 2021 as UK director at that point. So it was right at the beginning of what is being called the cluster sequencing process in the UK. So it was just when Boris Johnson had just announced a 10-point plan and committed to 10 CCUS clusters in the UK, and I joined soon after that. And then in September of this year, took over as CEO. And so I oversee, we've got two offices, one in London and one in Brussels, and I oversee both those offices. And we've recently focused on expanding the Brussels office as Europe is really starting to move forwards with CCUS. So that office is now really starting to drive forward with policy in the same way that we have been doing in the UK.
Wow, a lot going on and wide remit geographically. So I'm sure it's fascinating. We're really interested, as part of this podcast, we're really keen to hear about guests' kind of career journeys, if you like. And I'm aware that you've worked with the National Infrastructure Commission, Ofgem prior, but what kind of led you into I'll define it as the CCUS industry, so I'll have an abbreviation there. But yeah, keen to understand how you kind of got into it, and also what you enjoy most about it as well.
So I joined back sort of 4 years ago, and as you mentioned, sort of prior to that, I was at the National Infrastructure Commission. I'd been there for a couple of years working on their regulatory studies, so across economic regulation. And the work there was really interesting in terms of looking forward, long-term trajectories of infrastructure, what should happen over the next 25 years, how do we plan for that and move forward. And I'd moved there from Ofgem, the energy regulator, where I'd been involved in the sort of real nitty-gritty of regulation, so involved in price controls there, but also looking at forward policy proposals around things like local energy, electric vehicles, and how we would deal with those. And so I'd done the regulation bit and then done the long-term planning, and I saw this role, and actually having worked in renewables right at the beginning of renewables and the feed-in tariff and establishing that, it really caught my attention, because I thought actually working in an industry at the beginning of an industry. It's very exciting. There's a very just an exciting feel to it in terms of everyone really pulls together and everyone is following this same trajectory towards and this single aim of getting it going and really getting off the ground. And I'd started my career sort of way back in trade associations, and trade associations are really interesting in terms of the breadth of work. There is policy, there's events, there's the commercial side of it as well, and the external affairs, public affairs engagement, and influencing advocacy piece. And so I think for all these, it kind of brought it all together. And I thought, I'd really kind of like to get involved in that. And at the time, the government had just, not for the first time, but at that point had really got behind it. I thought this is, this would be an exciting industry to really get involved in and push to the next stage and see get off the ground in the UK.
Fantastic. And actually, just before we move on, for people kind of listening, I want to make sure that we can kind of capture this in terms of sort of layman's terms. Would you say that carbon capture, utilization and storage, this is about the kind of deployment of technology that captures CO2 emissions and either stores it or repurposes it for other uses? Is that fair kind of layman's summary?
Yeah, it's essentially, and it's a technology to help us reduce CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, to help us meet our carbon budget commitments. And so it's an integral, an essential part of that toolkit. So it works alongside renewables and other net zero technologies. It's not instead of those, it works alongside those, but particularly for industrial decarbonisation, CCUS is a critical tool in terms of helping some of our key critical industries decarbonise. And so effectively, yes, we capture the CO2 and for the most part, but not all, transport and then store it permanently under the seabed, but also can use it and have long-term, ideally sort of permanently use it as much as that's possible, so you're still removing it from the atmosphere for a long period of time.
Really. Like you mentioned there, it's this kind of space, it's sort of seen as I think it's widely recognised now that crucial part of global decarbonisation efforts there, as you've alluded to. But like with anything, one of these kind of endeavours and innovations, whatever you want to kind of badge it up as, not without its challenges. From your perspective, Olivia, and where you sit, the organisation that you lead, what do you see as the biggest hurdles right now facing the industry?
I think facing the industry is, this is from where we are. We know this technology works. It's worked and is proven. Globally, there are projects in operation. There are projects in Norway that have been successfully capturing and storing CO2 for well over 25 years. This isn't a new technology. I think the key challenge is for us now to be deploying it at the scale we need to remove the amount of CO2, to capture and reduce and remove the amount of CO2 that we need to from the atmosphere. So the real challenge here is that we move the industry to real commercialization and to the scale at which we need to roll it out across the UK and Europe and globally. I mean, there are many projects in development globally, and we're all, there is a race, I suppose, if you want to say, but we're really all now progressing and making huge strides towards really moving this industry forward. And so I think the key challenge is how do we do that? How do you create an industry at that scale? And how do you enable it to move forward? And so there's been an awful lot of work done in the UK, particularly around the legislative and regulatory framework, building that around that. So over the last 4 years, loads of work in terms of building business models, putting the legislation in place, and the regulations to be able to establish this framework where we have clusters, so groups of industrial industry players who will be capturing the CO2, so capture projects that tend to be grouped together, and then they would share the infrastructure, so they'd share the pipeline and the store, and then pipe the CO2 out to the store and store that permanently. So moving to a place where we've got these clusters, these CCUS clusters up and running. There are lots of different components, and I mentioned the value chain, lots of different parts of that value chain to pull together to make sure it all works together. So I think having very clear routes forward in terms of what is the framework to move forward, what's that clear policy framework to move forward, and this is where it's useful to look at what we've done in the past around renewables, for example. How did we go from having no wind farms to where we are now? What can we learn from those experiences, and what can we improve on? And also to create that market framework. So how will we pay for this? What are going to be the income streams, the revenue streams, to ensure that we can pay for it, and also then meet our carbon budget obligations. And I mentioned at the beginning, that this isn't the first time we've tried to deploy the industry in the UK. It is the most successful so far, and we've now got some projects that have reached financial close, and that's for the first time ever. So we've really moved it forward. But I think having net zero enshrined in legislation was a key marker in terms of giving that driver and that signal to industry that they've got to decarbonise by that date, and there's a clear route forward. So then it's almost sort of working backwards and saying, what are the steps we've got to put in place to make sure that we get there and that we can meet those carbon budgets. And for the UK, I think different countries around the world have different drivers. For the UK, we've got a large industrial base, and so that provide a significant proportion of our emissions, and so we've got to deal with that. And so that's been the driver around developing CCUS. We also have a significant potential for CO2 storage. So we've got roughly a third of Europe's potential CO2 offshore storage, and that's for the whole of Europe. And the EU states combined have about another third, and Norway is another, but roughly a third. So we're in a very good position in the UK in terms of having these natural geological assets where we can store CO2. And so how do we develop that to enable us to decarbonise our industries, but also to offer CO2 storage to other countries that also don't have access to the same storage. So for us, one of our key, in the CCSA as an organisation, one of our key primary objectives is to accelerate CCUS across UK, but also across Europe, and to have a European CO2 market.
And that's where your organisation come in terms of taking a leading kind of drive in that. And it's so just to kind of summarise on some points there, like you mentioned, this sort of technology, this has been going on for some time, particularly some examples in Scandinavia. But it sounds like there's a kind of objective now. How can we kind of get this industry, move it forward at scale? It sounds like there's been lots of legislation in the UK, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years. You talked about the clusters there and how industries can share the infrastructure. I think that's a really interesting takeaway. And I was not aware through my own research of the scale, the potential for the UK, especially in terms of storage, particularly offshore, and how we can, as speaking from a UK perspective, become a real kind of key player in this. So that's really interesting. Olivia, we've spoken about the challenges, but the opportunities here are vast. From what we can see, investment in CCUS, it seems to be growing rapidly. But what would you say is driving investment more? Is it more government commitments or private sector initiatives, or a mix of the two?
I think it's a mix of the two, and it's really important that the government sets that long-term policy framework. And we've seen that with government sort of setting out their commitment to 4 clusters, and then the targets of 50 million tons, 50 to 60 million tons to be captured and stored by 2035, and also targets in Europe. And this really helps signal to industry that there is a target here that we need to move towards, and we need to get to. What is also important is interim targets and the framework for how we get there. So one of the key asks of CCSA is around future allocation rounds and allocation frameworks. So very similar to what we've seen to offshore wind, the government kind of saying, right, they will run allocation rounds, they'll run competitions effectively at regular intervals, and then it signals to industry and to investors that there will be future opportunities to bid into those. So if you are developing a project, you might think, well, I won't be ready for the next one, but I will be ready for the one after that. And so that's what we'll work towards. And you can also understand the odds in terms of, you'll know what the pot of money is available, and you roughly know how many people will be, which projects will be going for it, and you can start to work out kind of what your odds are in terms of entering into that process. And that really helps everything sort of move forward, because at the moment the government committed 21.7 billion over 25 years, so just under $1 billion a year for the first projects, and we've seen financial close for the first 2 projects on the East Coast, in the Northeast, and we're waiting for the next ones, which we're expecting to be very soon on the West Coast, so in HyNet around Liverpool Bay. So having those first projects move forward is really critical, but then having the next stages of rolling out the next stages of projects and an understanding for the industry in terms of where they are. So the government launched this cluster sequencing, and so to the next clusters that come along, and also Track 1 expansion, which is about identifying other capture projects that can connect to that existing infrastructure. And the approach around clusters and cluster sequencing is around sharing that infrastructure, and therefore sharing the risk in terms of if one capture project were, for instance, to not go forward, or to suddenly stop to go out of business for some other reason, then there are other projects that are using that infrastructure, and so it's a much more it's much less risky way of progressing in terms of you build this infrastructure and you share it in much the way that lots of different wind farms will connect to a transmission network and share the costs of that and drive it through. So there are it's been about providing those signals, moving forward, and really letting the private sector know and investors know that this is the trajectory and there are opportunities. So whilst the government had made a big commitment with those first projects, any subsidy doesn't flow to those projects until they're operational. And these are large infrastructure projects that take a long time to get from the point at which they become a concept to then actually operating. It takes quite a number of years to get there, and all that time, that's private sector invested. So the private sector has been investing in all these projects, and CCSA did a piece of work 18 months ago. We're just in the process of updating it now, called the Delivery Plan, where we look at all the projects around the UK that are looking at CCUS to decarbonise. And we found over 90 projects, and our early signs in terms of the update is that it's at least that, and probably greater than that now. 90 projects across the UK they won't all go forward, but they're all seriously looking at carbon capture and storage as a route to decarbonisation. Wow. And so there's a huge potential, and they are all being invested in by the private sector. So when the Chancellor's talking about growth and stimulating growth, all of this already is, there is a lot of money flowing in, and we estimated at the CCSA, if we were to roll out to meet those targets, to meet 50 to 60 million tonnes to be captured and stored per year by 2035, it was around 20 to 30 billion pounds of private sector investment would be unlocked, and that's all upfront private sector investment. That's money that's the private sector is putting into these projects in the hope and in the expectation that at least a good proportion of them will go forward, and move forward to commercial and towards deployment. And so there is subsidy that needs to go in much the way that there has been in offshore wind, to get any new technology moving and get it working in that way. It's really, there needs to be this kind of top up, and the business model that the UK is based on is very similar to offshore wind in a broad sense in terms of a contract for difference. So it's a top up subsidy, and so the aim is that there is this top up subsidy while the industry gets going, to kind of pump prime the industry, and then once the industry gets moving and reaches commercial stages, those costs come down. The revenues, other revenue streams, income streams that will come in and help reduce that subsidy down. But you need government behind it at the beginning to get those projects really going, to help underwrite some of the risk of these big early infrastructure projects. And we know the difficulties of getting new nuclear and big new rail projects. It's challenging to get some of these big projects up and running. And so having this framework that industry has built with government, and government has played a really key role in leading all this forward, is there to try and mitigate some of those early risks, and to make sure that these early projects can go forward, and then we can roll out future projects.
Well, so it sounds like it's a real kind of a mix there with industry and with kind of government working together. There's a framework there, and such a kind of vast opportunity. I mean, you mentioned 90 potential projects there. I mean, that's
and these are right across. These are power projects, hydrogen projects, industrial projects like cement plants, refineries, chemical plants, energy from waste projects, and other greenhouse gas removal projects, so direct air capture, and BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture. So there are a whole breadth of projects within that, and they're quite broad ranging, but they're all projects right across the UK. But mainly, when you look at the map, it's a fortunate position that our industrial heartlands are also, for the most part, closely located to potential CO2 stores. So, you think of the northeast and the industries that are up there, and the northwest, same, located near stores, Scotland again. So a lot of them, and that's something that the UK has, which many other European countries don't have in the same way. We've got a high set of emissions that are located quite closely to these stores. And the other thing that we do have is a workforce. So we've got people who've worked in oil and gas and an expertise there in the offshore who need to transition. As we are moving away from fossil fuels, we have a workforce and an expertise that need to transition, part of like the just transition towards net zero. And so there is a natural way for, a natural movement from them to move into CCUS, because we need those skills, we need those expertise, and we also need to make sure that they've got jobs, and we keep the economy running in that way. So, and also for all the industries in these areas, we still need cement, and we still need chemicals, and we still need the products that refineries are making. Some of them are making products that we use for electric vehicles. They're really core industries of products that we still need and will be needing for quite a long time. And so to decarbonise those, we not only protect those people in those industries, because they'll have to decarbonise one way or another because it's in law. So they either decarbonise, for many of them CCUS is their only option, but and so if they don't put carbon capture there, then some of them will just face closure because they'll have to pay a carbon tax, and ultimately that will become expensive, and they'll just say, do you know what, we'll close this plant and we'll invest somewhere else where we are going to do carbon capture. A lot of these companies are big multinationals, and so it makes sense to do it here because you protect those jobs, you keep those people in work, but also you're creating what we call low carbon products. So you're creating we call green cement, which is cement that is low carbon cement that we can then sell as a new product, and we can be a leader in that in the UK because we're kickstarting that market, and we're able to, we can export our products and our expertise in the supply chain in terms of doing that. So it's a kind of no-win situation, and if you don't do it, it's not just a case of you maintain the status quo. If you don't do it, a lot of those industries are looking at a future of, well, what else? Because potentially it's just closure. So then you lose jobs. And when you think of some of those industrial areas around the UK that we earmark for levelling up, these are the main employment routes in those areas. That is, the steel industrial areas. So it has a kind of, there are lots of ticks to it in terms of protecting the economy and promoting growth and new technologies, and meeting net zero and providing export opportunities as well.
For sure. And it's interesting, isn't it, how this can link in tandem with a government, say, new industrial strategy, levelling up, the proximity of where this storage will be in terms of the industrial heartlands, the transition from people who perhaps had an oil and gas background. Like you say, there's so many kind of tick boxes here. We're sort of coming towards the sort of last few minutes, but just keen to get your thoughts in terms of, and there seems to be so much change in the industry over the past few years, but if we sort of fast forward 12 months, what do you think, are there any sort of hot topics in carbon capture and storage you can foresee, perhaps which we haven't touched on in this conversation?
I mean, it's an exciting year, and when we look at the global numbers of the number of projects that are in development, they are absolutely huge levels of growth. And the fact that the UK has now taken financial close on our first two projects, we're hoping the next 2-3 will be very soon. And so the UK becomes, has cemented itself as a kind of serious position here. There are also been projects that have reached financial close in Europe. Europe is massively moving, catching up and really moving at pace now to make sure that they're deploying their CCUS industry. I think the key thing here is making sure that we keep momentum. We need to move beyond, make sure that those first projects reach financial close and continue to develop, and we need the next ones to come along. So it's around government sort of providing clarity for those next projects. So for track 2, and this is Acorn in Scotland and Viking and the Humber, to give the certainty for those projects to move forward for track 1 expansion, both in the East Coast, so expanding those networks in the East Coast, and also filling up the networks on the West Coast, and just giving those long routes forward. So opening up the European market, there are a few barriers there in terms of sort of post-Brexit regulatory and legislative barriers, addressing those barriers, and I think the government's moving it very much in the right direction there. And there have been discussions with the EU in the last few days, to really try and move things forward and hopefully unlock some of those barriers so that there can be this pan-European market. And all of this, once you've got the very clear signals of moving forward, that then drives the supply chain and the skills and workforce. So I think governments have done a lot of work on how do we make sure we've got the right people skilled up? How do we make sure we've got the supply chain ready? Well, industry and investors respond to signals. So as soon as they know that there's a forward trajectory, then they will start training those workforces and make sure that that's ready. And obviously government can be there to help intervene in the right place. And I think it's really sort of holding firm and keeping that trajectory and momentum moving forward. Governments have obviously, got competing priorities all the time, lots of different things that are calling on. And I think, this industry, like you say, ticks so many boxes. It's just about keeping that momentum forward, finding those opportunities, and providing those signals. So, I mean, I think that's really clear, and being very clear on timescales. We need to give signals to these industries. The industrial strategy you mentioned is key for that. We've also got the infrastructure strategy, trade strategy, growth strategy. In the UK, there's an awful lot of spending review. All of these things are coming up and need to be aligned, and and make sure that they're talking to each other, because we are one technology in net zero, but there are also other technologies, and there's also other commitments. So it's absolutely making sure that we have that forward trajectory and we enable the industry to move forward. There's a huge amount of interest in this and ambition. So it's about providing the framework and the levers to keep that moving.
Well, look, Olivia, thanks so much for just really kind of illuminating conversation. I've learned a lot there, and hopefully people listening to this will have you've kind of brought it to life in terms of what's happened so far, where we are with things, not just from a UK perspective, but also the EU. And it sounds like it's going to be a fascinating few years ahead. So thank you so much for joining us, and we would love to have you back on in maybe a couple of years' time, and you can kind of provide us with an update on what's been happening in the industry. So thank you very much.
Be great. Thank you so much. Thank you.